Hello, I'm Karen Stathoplos, and I'm going to be reading you a short story by Shirley Jackson. And before I do, I'm just going to read you a little quote from a newspaper article. I love reading people's lists of their favorite scariest books. And I'm always happy when it agrees with mine. So this woman who has written this said, Stephen King's The Shining, truly horrendous. She includes Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, which is I don't know if it's scary, but it's very, very thrilling. And then she says Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, which she calls truly terrifying. And she isn't the only one. Numerous writers have cited The Haunting of Hill House as the scariest book they have ever read, including Neil Gaiman, who told The Times last year, "A maleficent house, real human protagonists, everything half seen or happening in the dark. It scared me as a teenager, and it haunts me still." So I'm not doing The Haunting of Hill House, but I read you that because this short story, actually it's from her life. This book is called Let Me Tell You by Shirley Jackson, and her children, after her death, gathered many of her writings. And she wrote a lot about her own experiences. And this one is called Good Old House, and it helps explain how she feels about houses and the things that happened to her in some of the houses she lived in, including this one. So this is Good Old House, a true story by Shirley Jackson. When we came to occupy our present house, we were not at first accepted. Although the neighbors welcomed us and took us in with the deep New England courtesy that is half tolerance and half humor, we shortly accustomed ourselves to trading at certain stores, and we bought our coal locally. We found a doctor and a dentist and a dog, and we went to the local movie theater and enrolled Laurie in the local nursery school. Still, the old house had grave reservations about us and would allow us to feel only provisionally at home. Twice the first week we were there, I awoke with nightmares of the old house shaking over me, malevolent and cruel, and after that, during our first few months, I frequently found myself awake after having walked in my sleep toward the front door. And once I found myself out between the pillars, as if running away. Our cats, who had lived with us for years in New York happily, could find no resting place in this house. All the places for cats to sleep, the spot behind the stove, the wooden rocker, they would not countenance it. They turned away, and our New York furniture had somehow become different, so that the armchair, which young Shax, the cat, had always slept in before, was often a cold corner and had no sun in the afternoons. Laurie went off pleasantly from the house to nursery school. He played happily in the yard and through the attics, but there was a corner of the hall where a wolf lived, and he would not go there alone. We had only been there about 3 weeks when I found an ad in the local paper for a woman who wanted to do housework, and things like that were pretty rare in our town, so I telephoned her immediately, asked if she could come to work for us. She was pleased to have an answer to her ad so quickly, and terms were quickly and easily settled between us. I agreed to her charges, she approved of the children, we reached an honorable agreement about laundry, and then she asked, her voice trim and clean over the phone, "I clean forgot to ask you, missus, where do you live?" "In the old Ogilvy house," I said readily, "the one with the "Where?" she asked. The old Ogilvy house, did you say? The Fielding place?" "That's right," I said, "the one with—" "I'm sorry, missus," she said, and her voice sounded really regretful. "I guess I can't come to work for you after all." "Why not?" "Well," she said, "it's too far," she said. "I'll take care of your transportation." "Well," she said, "I guess I better not." "But why?" I asked, but she had hung up. No one liked to come into the house. We discovered much later that the painters and plumbers and carpenters Mr. Fielding had hired before we came had demanded extravagantly high pay, and Mr. Fielding had agreed to stay with them all the time they worked in the house. My grocer, who was very helpful about delivering orders, could never find a delivery boy who would leave my groceries any closer to the house than the end of the lawn. Our neighbors would stand and talk interminably at the front door or the back, But they would never come inside, and the attempts I made to invite them in for tea met with faint but polite incredulity. Toward the end of our first month, the painter arrived to do the outside of the house. As always, we were not consulted. The house had always been white with green trim, as were all the other houses on the block, and I suppose all the other houses in New England. And the painter did not for a minute imagine that anything else would be required of him. Indeed, I doubt if he owned any other colors of paint. The first day he worked, I went out to talk to him and took him a cup of coffee. He was on a ladder painting the pillars. "Nice to see the old house cleaned up," he said, after we'd spoken about the weather and had taken care of such other conversational preliminaries, such as the rent we paid for the house, my husband's income, and our opinion of the town. "I can't believe it's the same house we saw last year," I said. I turned, as I frequently did, to look through the glass panes of the front door into our pleasant light hall, with the dining room showing beyond, and the bright curtains, and the pretty rugs, and the lines of plants against the windows. "I'm so happy here," I said, realizing, as I said it, that I was. "You know," the painter said, applying himself industriously to the pillar, "it don't seem to matter much what folks get to thinking about a house. When you get people living there, it all changes. This house has seen a lot of people going in and out." "It's a good old house," he said, "spite of what they say. It's a good, solid house, and not many like it nowadays." He turned and waved the paintbrush at me. "Kids wouldn't go past it at night," he said. "I didn't know that," I said. "Do they feel any different now?" "Well, no," the painter said. He seemed afraid that he might have hurt my feelings, because he added quickly, "It's a good old house, though." There was another strange quality to the house. It had an odd effect on the things in it. Never the old things, of course. They seemed to belong and to understand, but only our newer things, such as the living room clock, which had been a wedding present and had worked perfectly well until we moved into this old house. It stopped every day at 5 minutes to 5. For a little while, I thought it was an eccentricity of my own, that perhaps I did not wind it enough, or perhaps I had noticed that once or twice it had stopped near 5 o'clock and fell to believing that it stopped every day. I made a point of winding it carefully, and then it got so that I was checking it regularly, and I would glance at it every time I passed the living room. Finally, I came to accept as natural the fact that it would stop every day at 5 minutes of 5. And when the 5 o'clock whistles blew at the lumberyard, I went in and restarted the clock. It became an almost habitual small gesture, like checking to see if the children were all right at night. And I timed myself by it, knowing that when I had to restart the clock, it was time to start making the children supper. The window in the back bedroom was another thing. It was ordinary glass. I knew that because I had had a glazier in to change it. But no matter when you looked out of it, and no matter what the weather was like outside, it was opaque, as though a cloth were over the outside of it. When the glazier was working on it and had taken out the glass, he had held the new glass outside the window and looked through it. I could see his face clearly, as though through an ordinary window. And then he set the new pane of glass into the frame, dusted his hands, closed the window, and we looked through it together, and it was opaque. When we opened the window and looked out, we saw the maple trees outside and the sky. The glazier, who was a local man, smiled and shrugged and refused his pay and touched one of the pillars gently as he went down the steps. Still, another troubling thing was the way small articles disappeared. I realized that in a large house with children, things are always disappearing anyways, but this was different. It was as though there were little pockets of time in the house into which things dropped for a little while and then came back. Small things disappeared, such as scissors and pencils and spoons. All things you might expect to lose, but of course do not expect to find back again in their accustomed places. Sometimes it was larger things that stepped out, such as kitchen utensils. I remember one evening I went into the pantry to get a strainer off the shelf, groping absent-mindedly the way you do when a thing is always kept in the same place and you reach for it without looking, and it was not there. I spent the next 2 days taking the pantry apart to find the strainer, and I looked as far afield as the playroom and the tool chest. And at the end of the 2 days, I went into the pantry absent-mindedly, put up my hand to take down the strainer, and it was there. Once a little round rug disappeared for almost a week from the study as though it had been absorbed into the floor and reappeared after a while, looking the same as ever, and so natural that for a while we forgot to be surprised that it was there. Several times I left groceries on the kitchen table and found them later neatly put away in the pantry. One reason I am sure that I do not do this myself in a sort of trance is that the refrigerator is never used. Butter and milk and such are set on the pantry windowsill where it is cool. Once, buttons appeared, newly sewn onto my son's jacket, and another time my daughter's stuffed lamb had a blue ribbon removed and a pink one substituted. A day or so later, the blue ribbon was back, washed and ironed. None of these things bothered us excessively. We have always been a family that carries bewilderment like a banner, and odd new confusions do not actually seem to be any more bewildering than the ones we invent for ourselves. Moreover, in each of these cases, it was easier to believe that nothing had happened, or that it was of no importance anyway. We spoke affectionately of poltergeists and pixies and affected to believe that each single instance was some unconscious behavior on our own parts. Laurie, who believed in any case in good and bad fairies, adjusted quickly and easily to the oddities and was completely unaffected after a while. Although my husband and I received a little jolt when on Christmas morning, Laurie found a second stocking hung up against the mantel as though it had been feared we might forget. And there was the time when he lost a tooth, forgot to tell us, and found in the morning 2 dimes under his pillow. However, after a while, the house seemed to gain a certain amount of confidence in us, and only Laurie ever experienced this pleasing duplication. Although Joanne's clothes are still mended occasionally, that being a field in which the house can have no legitimate confidence in me. It's not hard, after all, to live with such things, and after a while they do not seem much more unnatural than that water should change its form when heat is applied, or that trees should change color in the fall. I recall that the first week with our first television set shocked me much more deeply. I have grown used to the tricks of the house as I have grown used to the dip in the kitchen floor beside the windows and the stair that creaks or the study window that will not open at all. My husband, who does not come into as intimate contact with the house as I do, is consequently less troubled, although he was quite surprised when a nearly empty bottle of whiskey disappeared and was lost to him for a day, then returned full. I think perhaps a great reason for our relaxing into this mild acceptance was the complete ease with which these small things were accomplished, frequently so unobtrusively that it was not until afterward that we realized something had happened. When Joanne's good silver spoon vanished, the one she loved to eat with, it disappeared from my hand in the dish towel. That is, I was drying it, as I do every night, and as I reached forward to slip it into the drawer along with the other silverware, it was gone. I had seen it the moment before and then did not see it the moment after. I looked for it, of course, but without much enthusiasm, knowing without admitting it that I need not bother. A day or so later, after Joanne had become reconciled to using another spoon, I was drying silverware, and as I was slipping it into the drawer, Joanne's spoon fell into place. I knew the spoon had been gone and that I had been looking for it, but it was returned so naturally that I closed the drawer and then thought and opened the drawer and saw that the spoon was really there. Perhaps it was exactly because we took this cheerful teasing so well that one day, near the end of our first year in the house, the doorbell rang, at about 11 o'clock in the morning. Laurie was in school, Joanne was in her playpen in the children's room, and I was making dough for gingerbread men that we would cut out in the afternoon. I remember that when I went to answer the door, I thought idly that probably my mixing bowl and spoon, my cups and rolling pin would all be washed and returned to their place by the time I came back. There was an old lady at the door, dressed in black and smiling. I'm so very troubled. Sorry to trouble you, she said as soon as I opened the door. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Not at all, I said. Won't you come in? I added, because she was obviously intending to come in anyway. Thank you, she said, and stepped daintily inside. She looked around the hall curiously, then smiled. I used to visit here very often, she said. I was passing by and thought how wonderful it is to see the old house occupied again. She waved her hand apologetically. I couldn't go on without stopping in for one more look at that old house. I'm very glad you did, I said. Won't you come in and look around? She followed me into the living room, stopping once to touch the shining wood of the old stair rail. And in the living room, she went directly to the old wooden rocker and sat down, turning her head to look around. It's really not very much changed, she said. It's a lovely old house, I said. Do you think so? She turned quickly to look at me. Do you really think it's a lovely old house? We're very happy here. I am glad. She folded her hands and smiled again as though to herself. It's always been such a good house, she said. The old doctor always used to say it was a good house. The old doctor? Dr. Ogilvy. She smiled at me again. Dr. Ogilvy? I see they kept the pillars after all, she said, nodding. We always thought they gave the house character. There was a hornet's nest in one, I said inadequately. Dr. Ogilvy had built the house in 1816. Which one? The one on the right end. She nodded again. There always was, she said. What was it like when you visited here, I asked. Oh, my dear, she said, and smiled on me as from a long way off. It was very gay then, you know. There were no other houses for miles around, you know, and we all came in carriages. But the Fieldings built the other houses, I began, and she interrupted me, her soft cheeks faintly pink. No other houses we visited, of course. I was silent, a little anxious. And then Shax, the cat, came into the room, without footsteps, but making his presence known the way a cat does. The old lady turned and looked at him for a moment and then said, Fine fellow. She put down one black-gloved hand, and Shax went to her, touched her glove with his nose, and poured himself into her lap. She stroked him comfortably while she said to me, They've taken away the old wallpaper, and I suppose the front bedroom isn't blue anymore. It's blue, I said, wondering. Someone chose a very pretty blue paper for that room. I'm glad the Fieldings kept it up, she said. So often you can't tell when a young family buys into a home. Sometimes they change the old things. We've been trying to keep it comfortable, I said. I remember, she said. I remember when the Fieldings first offered to buy it. We sat upstairs in the blue front room, Sally, Cortland, and I, and we tried to think what the Fieldings might do to the house. The Cortlands hadn't really been here long, of course. The Ogilvys built it. We brought the pillars from Boston. I could think of nothing to say, and after a minute she put Jax down and said, May I look at the rest of the house? Are you busy? She liked the way the bedrooms were all the same colors, and the children's room pleased her. What a pretty child you are indeed, she said to Joanne in the playpen, and Joanne looked up, considered, and smiled. It needs children, this house, the old lady said, touching me on the arm as we went out the door. It was the sorrow of Anne Ogilvy's life. When we moved at last to the kitchen and she saw my half-finished gingerbread, she was amused and picked up the bowl to examine the dough. "You get it good and short," she said. "It won't bake even if you don't get it good and short, and put in a little coffee. The children are going to cut out the gingerbread men this afternoon." "With raisin eyes," she added and sighed. Then she laughed softly. "Still the same old house," she said. I went with her to the door, and she stood for a minute looking back into the house, as I often do. Then she smiled at me once more, affectionately, thanked me, and I watched her go off down the walk. When I closed the door, I leaned one hand against the door frame, and it seemed to me that for the first time, the old house responded, turning in toward me protectively. When I went back into the living room, Shax was asleep on the wooden rocker. And that afternoon, one of my neighbors dropped in for a cup of coffee, coming through the back door so naturally that neither of us thought of her never having come in before. Small things still disappear, of course, and for a while Joanne spoke occasionally of a faraway voice that sang to her at night. Once I went into the kitchen and found a still warm pumpkin pie on the table covered with a clean cloth. We had it for dinner and praised it in voices we hoped would carry through the old house. The end.